This is the sunset of the petrodollar.
Start investing in gold and silver at sdbullion.com today and join over 35,000 precious metals investors who have made the switch to the lowest gold and silver prices in the industry. SD Bullion recently claimed a spot on the prestigious Inc. 500, making them one of the fastest growing bullion companies in the United States. With low bullion prices and over-the-top customer service, SD Bullion is setting the standard for precious metals transactions. Visit www.sdbullion.com today. Start saving on every precious metals purchase you make.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with silverdoctors.com, and back with us today is Dr. Jim Willie, editor of the Hat-Trick Letter, found on goldenjackass.com. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be back. These are climax times, not just interesting times, and you can actually point to maybe 3 or 4 different events every week related to the sunset of the dollar. Very exciting, also quite dangerous. As much interesting and intriguing as dangerous for the disruptions. I think we're going to see a number of events happen in the next several months that could hit the U.S. mainland. I mean, like difficulties with imports. I mean, with pressures to launch a new dollar, domestic only. I mean, just problems separating the dollar domestically from the dollar in foreign banks. This whole issue of the petrodollar, payments internationally for oil, the whole system is breaking down that has stood since 1973 or so. These are very interesting and disruptive times. And, you know, I try to watch once in a while the U.S. news, and I've yet to find a story that relates to the dollar and its transition. It's still the same old BS regarding, you know, the budgets and Russian element with Trump, and now it's the National Football League and the national anthem, and it's just a bunch of nonsense in the news that does not relate to the most important issue, I think, in 40 years. We just had one of the most important events occur in the last 40 years in the financial front, and that was China announcing the imminent rollout of their oil Yuan gold futures contract. They're essentially setting up a vehicle, an instrument, which will create a platform whereby countries can buy oil and pay for it, not in dollars, but in gold. Unbelievable. This is going to take shape, Elijah, into what I have forecasted for the last 3 or 4 years, maybe more, 5 years. Yeah, it was right around 2012 and 13 that I forecasted the arrival of the gold trade note. And I said it would first arrive in the oil market. It would be an instrument whereby countries would post a gold deposit, like in a margin deposit. And it would be used to secure the payment for a shipment of oil, like a tanker. And that is exactly what China just did. It's going to take shape eventually into what I call the gold trade note, which is basically a short-term bond, a bill. If you reduce the duration, the maturity of a U.S. Treasury bond, you get a U.S. Treasury bill. They're going to shape this oil for gold contract with the Chinese currency in the middle. They're going to shape it eventually into a short-term bill. And that will be exactly the gold trade note that I've been describing. So this is the sunset of the petrodollar. If you're looking for really solid evidence that the petrodollar is dead, look no further than for discord and disunity and fracture of OPEC itself. The oil cartel is pretty much a dead, defunct entity. And that's not an exaggeration. You can look at the last 2 years of their meetings, 2 years of their accords. Nothing is honored, only bickering. And I love to say this. They cannot agree on their name tags or their lunch menu. And now the irony is thick. They had agreements on oil output in OPEC a year ago, and Saudi did not honor them because Saudi needs a lot of income to finance their filthy, dirty criminal war in Yemen. And now the opposite has occurred, Elijah. The Saudis are trying again to limit the output with some kind of Russian cooperation, and the other OPEC nations are not honoring it. So OPEC has no unity, has no accords, and OPEC is on the verge of being replaced by other energy cartels. This is very exciting, but also filled with risk.
Now, with regard to the gold-backed oil's futures contract denominated in yuan, you talked about how, this is basically that the Chinese will be able to trade oil in gold now, and it's not even using the US dollar at all because the futures contracts are denominated in yuan. Can you expand a little bit on how this will impact the dollar?
Well, it pushes the dollar out of the room for the oil trade entirely, but I think only in the Eastern Hemisphere, among the Asian nations. Among China and its following of nations. It's going to be very interesting to watch countries like Korea and Japan, South Korea and Japan. Let's see how they arrange their payments. But if China has a contract for securing an oil payment, it's going to be interesting to see who latches onto this contract from the supply side. And the United States might pressure nations not to cooperate, but I think the Saudis and the Gulf region nations like Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Oman, I think they're going to latch on. They don't want to lose their significant Chinese oil trade. It's interesting that the Arab nations in the Gulf are in competition to retain their Chinese oil trade. If one of them drops out and doesn't cooperate, others are going to pick up and just take away. If Kuwait, for instance, says, we don't want to have anything to do with this contract. We don't want any problems with the Americans. We don't want any problem with our dollar buddies. Then another Arab nation in the Gulf is going to pick up that Kuwait business and run with it. So the competition is fierce. And I don't think these Arab nations are going to drop off the Chinese because they're desperate to hold on and retain their income. They're all running deficits because the oil price is half what it used to be. And the Arab nations, the Arab oil monarchies have not reduced their budgets much. So they're running big deficits. This is very new for the oil monarchies. They're not accustomed to deficits. They almost never have issued bonds to cover their government deficits. That's what the Saudis have been doing now the last couple of years. They're so desperate in Saudi land that they're looking to do a 10% IPO, initial public offering stock, for their giant Aramco, the largest oil corporation in the world. It's their petrochemical national industry. It's not just a company, it's an industry. So how is it going to affect the dollar? It's going to marginalize the dollar. But I just don't know exactly where yet. It's a device and instrument for oil sales that will make the dollar irrelevant. But we don't know which nations will participate And the ones that do will have an end result of marginalizing the dollar. This is the end of the petrodollar in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Asia, emerging market nations. You just had confirmation at the BRICS conference. I think it was in an eastern province of China. And President Xi of China and President Putin of Russia, back to back, talked about their support of the non-dollar platforms for oil sales. This is like a universal strike in the East that is saying we're not going to use the dollar anymore for oil trade. And you know, think about it logically. China buys Saudi oil. What involvement does the United States have in that? None. So why should they use the dollar in the transaction? They shouldn't, and they're not going to. And they've been awaiting for the last few years an instrument which to use for eliminating the dollar in that trade. And what China has done is it's far more than pushed the dollar off the table and out of the room for Eastern oil sales. They've linked the oil market to gold. This is extraordinarily dangerous for the dollar. If a lot of other nations latch onto this, the United States might actually have a little bit of trouble importing oil. I've been forecasting for the last year or more that pressures on import supply, you know, the supply chain of the United States economy, is going to be put in danger just by virtue of the fact that other nations that export to the U.S. will not want to accept the Treasury bill. Well, if they start demanding this Chinese oil gold contract, and it really does need a short-term bill, a note, an instrument for trade that is exchanged hand to hand, where the backing of it is this futures contract in Shanghai. They need the note, the gold trade note, and I think it's coming. I mean, it's like saying, well, here comes the sunrise. All right, well, where are the shadows? Well, the sun's here. Well, where are the shadows? Okay, the shadows are coming. The shadows are the gold trade note from this contract. And oh my gosh, it's going to be very exciting to see what I believe it will be coming, and that is the U.S. government and the military saying, we're not going to fight this. It's what I call the peaceful coexistence and the dual universe. I think the dual universe is going to have the U.S. dollar centered in the West and the Chinese yuan and gold side by side centered in the East. And the U.S. is going to say, well, you know, you want to do your trade for oil in RMB, that's fine. Go ahead, knock yourself out. And it's going to just grow. It's going to grow a whole lot more than what Washington and New York expect. So big dangers coming, Elijah, for the dollar. This is the sunset. The sunset's going to have 4 or 5 different ramifications. I've mentioned how payment in treasury bills is going to be one thing that does not happen as much anymore. It'll still happen, but not as much. The decay of the petrodollar is affirmed here. But OPEC has become irrelevant. And I would like to talk about the energy cartels and consortium, if you don't mind. I think it's very important what is coming to replace OPEC.
Definitely. If you'd like to discuss a little bit and share with our viewers what your thoughts are on what will come after OPEC, that would be great.
Okay, you got some very interesting indications. It was a few months ago, we saw some news that the Saudis were going to sell a certain volume of oil to Russia and Rosneft. And my ears perked up right away because they're competitors. Saudis used to be number one oil producer and exporter in the world. That distinction has been taken by Russia. So why would Russia buy Saudi oil? Well, I'll tell you why. Because the Russians are creating an oil consortium. They're creating a pool for sale of oil. And they're trying to gather in partners. And one great way to gather in partners is to guarantee an income stream to countries like Saudi that are running deficits. But that leaves Russia with a couple of tasks. They must mix the blends to make sure the viscosity is right, and they must assure that the contaminant level is low. I'm talking about sulfur levels. Okay, so the Russians are creating a pool of oil supply. And the main characteristic of it is that the sales will not be in the dollar. Okay, that pretty much knocks OPEC dead if it gathers momentum. And the momentum can be seen with the Venezuelans doing the same thing with Russia and Rosneft. Venezuela is in even a tighter bind for cash flow. They're in the middle of a revolution that's hit their streets. So the Russians come in, Rosneft signs a deal to buy some Venezuelan oil. Venezuela's in a unique position. Their oil, they've got vast reserves. Orinoco, I don't know exactly how you pronounce it. I've only seen it written. But they've got very heavy viscosity oil in Venezuela. They had a problem in the last year in Venezuela not having sufficient cash. Cash to purchase Nigerian oil with which to mix in order to reduce the viscosity so that it's sellable in the oil market. Well, now the Russians are going to handle that and provide Venezuela with the cash flow. So they'll buy Venezuelan oil and they'll take care, in Russia, they'll take care in the oil consortium pool. They'll take care of the viscosity issues. Wow. Iran has done the same thing with Russia. What they do is they gain RMB currency cash flow because the Russians are sitting on a lot of RMB Chinese currency from all the sale of oil to China from Russia. So out goes the RMB to Iran. Iran supplies oil to the consortium, and all of it is managed again by Russia, and none is sold in the dollar. Okay, this replaces OPEC. And if you think it won't spread, you're just wrong, because so many countries that are deeply involved and committed for their national budgets on their oil revenue are in trouble. Russian Rosneft is now in talks with Mexico for the same kind of deal. I wouldn't be surprised if Mexico signs over some concessions on their big new Gulf of Mexico oil discovery so that Russia will provide the cash flow for I hate the word infrastructure, for the massive capital investment required for these not too deep, these are somewhat shallow Gulf of Mexico oil discoveries. So Russia has the cash flow from China. Russia is sharing the cash flow with desperate nations and oil producers who have their problems. Okay, that's the oil side. The gas side is a little bit simpler, but full of conflict. The Russians, with Qatar and Iran, are trying to build a gas pipeline through Syria to hit the Mediterranean and supply Western Europe and join up with the Gazprom gas pipelines. And the United States doesn't like it. So they created a Syrian war. When in any Western news broadcast regarding the Syrian war have you heard the phrase, the Iranian gas pipeline? Nowhere. But it's the biggest motive for the war, to block the Iranian gas pipeline. When do you hear the Syrian war and a connection to the Iran gas pipeline? Where? In the hat-trick letter. In every single monthly report. Instead, you hear the propaganda about ISIS and the independent Muslim guerrillas, which, by the way, are all run by the U.S. military and the Mossad of Israel. People need to wake up. ISIS is run by Langley. People need to wake up. ISIS is run by Mossad. There have been captured Israeli officers commanding militia, little troop groups in Syria, Israeli commanders. And, it's not shown in the Western press because, gosh, you don't want to cause a problem revealing the truth in Western press. Okay, this Iran, Russia, Qatar gas pipeline is going to grow. It's going to succeed. It will be completed. It will feed into the Russian Gazprom pipeline system. It will supply Western Europe, and the United States and Israel cannot stop it. Its biggest feature will be sales of gas not in the dollar. Okay, so OPEC is going to be replaced by the Russian oil consortium and the Iranian gas pipeline. This is precisely why the United States has created new sanctions against Iran, even after the Iran nuclear deal. And the United States is proving itself to be a rogue nation, dishonoring a treaty in less than 6 months. But then again, if you check history, you won't find the United States honoring any treaty, starting with the Native American Indians. Any treaty. The United States dishonored the NATO treaty with respect to the Soviet Union / Russia. Why? Because we feel like it. Full spectrum dominance, dude. Oh, gosh. The United States doesn't have any full spectrum dominance anymore. Okay, so I explained the Russian oil consortium sold outside the dollar. I explained the Iran and Russian Qatar gas cartel with its pipeline. Again, sales not in the dollar. This is how OPEC completely disappears from the news headlines. And the big loss for them is they're going to find no reason to go to Austria for their conferences. They like to get out of town. So we're actually going to see, and it's already starting, we're going to see the fall of numerous Arab / Muslim oil monarchies. They're just going to fall, one after the other. Not all of them, but most of them. It's going to be very interesting. They're running out of reserves. They're running big deficits. They really don't know how to conduct bond sales. And they're running out of friends. They're bickering among themselves. I mean, this Saudi-Qatari squabble is almost hilarious.
Now, moving to viewers' questions, this viewer is wanting to know, we've heard what you think will happen to the U.S. dollar, and you're saying that basically it's sunset for the U.S. dollar, but they're wanting to know, what is your perspective on what will happen to the euro, Chinese yuan, and Japanese yen?
When the dollar goes down, by that I mean gets rejected, it's really going to signal the end for fiat currency. One of the funniest little phenomena now is that people are expecting the dollar to decline, and it has come down a little, but it's still above where it was 2 years ago. So what kind of a crash is that? It's still above where it was in 2015 when this big dollar universal rally began. When the dollar starts to lose its faith and integrity among holders, I think it signals a sunset for all fiat currencies. And that includes the euro and the yen. I wouldn't worry so much about the Chinese RMB being in trouble because they're going to be the first ones to convert and announce their redeemability in gold. By that I mean the Chinese will issue the first gold-backed currency. So I wouldn't worry about the RMB for its value. I'd worry about the nations that don't climb on the gold wagon. The euro is a unique currency, but the funny part is you can't see a big decline in the dollar index because 52% of the dollar index is the euro. So how high can the euro go given all of its problems? I mean, like huge deficits by member nations, disunity among the countries themselves within the EU, disputes over the Arab human garbage influx, disputes over the Russian sanctions and orders by the U.S. government to toe the line, rejection by the EU member nations of the United States fascist trade union, resistance by the EU member nations in NATO for arming even further near the Russian border. Okay, so these are the European problems, in addition to huge bank insolvency in the southern nations like Italy and Spain, Portugal. I mean, Greece is destroyed. You don't need to talk about them anymore. That's mission accomplished. So if the dollar goes down a lot, how much can the European euro go up? Not much. So, you've got a tethering there. It's like a sinking swimmer. He can't really drown because he can't go down far in the water since the euro is so pathetic. It doesn't have the ability to rise up. It doesn't have that buoyancy. So the euro and the dollar are pretty much tied together, even though they're in competition in the U.S. dollar index. I don't look at the dollar index as much as I look at the dollar versus gold and the yuan versus gold, the Chinese currency. So when big problems come for the United States on the import supply chain, and they're going to be under tremendous pressure, they'll resist. Don't worry about it. They'll resist for several more months, but they shouldn't, before creating a new domestic dollar. I call it the Scheiss dollar. That's German for shit, flotsam, jetsam, refuse, rubbish. They'll be under pressure to issue and launch a new dollar. But during that time, it's going to be a grand tarnishing of all the fiat currencies. What is behind the euro currency? Insolvent government, one after another. Sovereign bonds that aren't worth crap that are supported by the European Central Bank, just like the Treasury bonds supported by the Fed. Take away the Fed, take away Draghi's Euro Central Bank, and all the Western European and US bonds start to crater. And the bond yields go up, up, up. I mean like 10%. They call it stimulus. It's not. It's disaster prevention. So in the coming months, you're going to see a lot of tarnishing of the fiat currency regime. And I think all those currencies mentioned by you, except for the Chinese, are going to be in big, big trouble. I mean, the Japanese have a significant export industry, and that keeps their currency going. But they've got the largest deficit per GNP, the percentage of GNP. They have the largest deficit compared to the size of their economy of any nation that is a U.S. strong ally. They're just in pathetic shape in Japan. So I'm watching Japan to see how much they tie in with the Chinese golden moorings, the big pier to save the ships and dock the ships. How much is China going to link up with Japan? And that's not all. It's Japan linking up with Russia for LNG gas facilities and gas pipelines. They're starting a construction of a gas pipeline. I'm surprised the United States doesn't try to blow it up. That's what we do. We blow it up because that's good for the global economy, right? Blowing things up. Am I off base here, Elijah? Is the U.S. priority of blowing things up in the global economy, is that good for the global economy?
Definitely not.
That's all we do. That's all we do. One area after another. Threats to keep up the dollar support. Internal terrorism infused. Threats with military exercises nearby. Sanctions. Obstructions. And arms sales. While China does the opposite. They set up commercial deals, infrastructure, construction deals, barter funding deals, construction of community schools, railways, various things, port facilities. The U.S. blows things up because that's good for the global economy. Blow things up. Well, what they're blowing up is the dollar, Elijah, and it's happening in real time. And now it's starting to accelerate with this Chinese oil for gold instrument, and it's got a launch planned in a few weeks. Going to be very interesting to watch. And in my view, it's kind of a follow-on for the Hong Kong Gold Exchange, which will work very closely with the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So you have two Chinese gold exchanges, one leg of the Chinamen inside China, the other leg outside China. But, you know, Hong Kong is kind of both in and out of China. It still acts like a British colony with its independence, but the Chinese have told Hong Kong, just continue in your independent ways under our blessing. Okay, so that's the Chinese rule of the day with respect to Hong Kong. They haven't changed much in the way they operate. One of the biggest changes that's come to Hong Kong is not so much commercial events as it is Chinese bringing over cash to Hong Kong because they expect their own Chinese holdings to go down temporarily in value, and they expect the Hong Kong dollar to go up when they drop their peg versus the dollar. So there's a lot of Chinese money coming into Hong Kong banks. And the other one is more a social phenomenon. It's the appearance of a lot more Chinese with bad teeth, bad dental appearance, and they're from mainland China. And there's a rude practice that's really quite popular and extremely noted in Hong Kong, and that's Chinese natives jumping the line for taxis. So the interaction between China and Hong Kong is a little bit strained, but very interesting. We just have so many things going on. It's like the Chinese just raise the stakes at the poker table. Watch this dual universe grow. Watch the RMB sphere increase in the number of nations that participate. And that includes all the sign-ons for the Eurasian trade zone. I'm talking about all the former Soviet republics, China and its neighbors. Watch Taiwan, watch Korea. Those are going to be key nations. All the emerging market nations, all the BRICS nations, the BRICS alliance nations, there are 140 of them. A lot of small nations in there. Collectively, they're not so small. They're all going to join the RMB universe. And they're producers. Whenever you have a BRICS conference or a One Belt, One Road conference, that's basically the Eurasian Trade Zone headquarters, headquarter project, One Belt, One Road. It's a table for bringing together funding, projects, consultants, construction forces, etc. Whenever they have a meeting, they tend to remind us that they control a significant portion of the global population and the global economy. That's what I called a couple of years ago critical mass. The East, with the Eurasian trade zone, with the emerging market nations, and with BRICS, they provide the critical mass for abandoning the dollar. And they will form the nucleus of the RMB universe. U.S. cannot stop it. We can't do our usual thing of invade, destroy their economy. We cannot do our usual thing of sanctioning their banks and strangling them for their cash input. We can't do our usual thing. We cannot blow them all up. I have a new catchphrase. The United States is going to continue in its path and alienate the rest of the world, including its allies. And that will earn the United States its isolation. First comes the isolation financially and economically, Elijah.
Moving now to this next viewer's question, Larry is wanting to know, when the dollar goes away and freezes up, what will happen to home mortgages?
Wow, this is one of the big mysterious questions. It's not just home mortgages, car loans, it's, room addition loans, second mortgage line of credit, all these different financial credit lines. What's going to happen? We don't really know. So what I like to do is cite precedent and cite the opposing factions with their forces. The precedent is 1993, Mexico. They had a big devaluation of about 30%. Robert Rubin was Treasury Secretary at the time for the U.S. government, Clinton administration. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember where I was living. I remember watching the news when it was happening. I remember the turmoil in the currency markets. It was big news. And what was not in the news so much was the effect on the Mexicans who had debt. In the following years, it became very clear what happened. Their debt balances went up because the currency for the Mexican peso went down. In other words, the debt balances remained constant with respect to the former valuation of the Mexican peso. Why'd they do that? So the banks would not lose anything. The Mexican banks screwed the Mexican citizens and credit holders. I don't like that word. Borrowers. Okay. In the United States, let me say comfortably that the banking community, the bankers, and that whole political force has 100 times the power of the Mexican banks in 1993. So will the American banks require the borrowers to suffer in order to preserve the bank balance sheet? Hell yeah! Where will that be applied? Home mortgages, second mortgages, car loans, construction loans. I'm anxious to see what happens with the big commercial loans, like, say, IBM with its JP Morgan credit line and loan portfolio. How's that going to be affected? That's going to be the real interesting side, because I expect the homeowners and the little guy, the borrowers in the United States, to get a hot poker up their bums. They're going to get screwed badly. It's going to lead to a lot of defaults. If you thought that the end came for home foreclosures, no, it's going to be a second round. I think it's going to be with the introduction of the new dollar and the preservation of the loan balances with perspective on the amount at the origin from the banker's view. They're going to preserve their loan balance. You think the banks are going to say, well, we got a 30% devaluation of this new Scheist dollar. We're going to give a 30% discount to all our $1 trillion worth of mortgages? Hell no! So you got the forces of the banks preserving their balance sheets versus the individuals fighting off bankruptcy. I expect the bankers to win because the bankers are running the U.S. government with the help of the narcotics boys at Langley. If you think I'm far off, you're dead wrong. Dead wrong. Wall Street banks rely on a significant portion of their income from narcotics money laundering. They're all in this together. They're not going to say, let's give a nice big discount to the homeowners and the car owners. Let's help them out. Not going to do it. I don't think there's going to be any break to the U.S. citizens who are borrowers. Now, if the U.S. government and the Fed are consistent and fair players in their largesse and their excesses, they will do some kind of a derivative conversion to help out all the mortgages. Let's watch to see what they do with the FHA-backed Fannie Mae mortgages. Will they let them fail, or will they work some kind of a derivative in there to preserve the payment schedule? This has many different sides to it. It's worth watching the FHA/Fannie element with respect to the banks and the mortgages and the homeowners. That's where rubber will hit the road. That's going to be where the guidelines are made. The little banks, though, if they grant the discount on the devaluation to the little guys, the little banks are going to die very quickly. So I don't expect that they will. Again, Mexico is your precedent. It's really not in the news. Mexico's history is not in the news. It's well established what they did. They helped the banks.
All right, now moving to our last viewer's question. This viewer wants to know what resources they should look to in order to keep up with the issues and events you talk about. Do you recommend any news sources or websites?
Sure. www.goldenjackass.com. It's called the Hat-Trick Letter. It's the best assembly of information regarding the sunset of the dollar and the rise of the gold trade note. I've been talking about the gold trade note for 3 years at least. So my clients are not saying, wow, that came out of left field. Instead, my clients, I'm talking about at least 50 email compliments in the last 2 weeks. Clients are saying, wow, Jim, this is exactly what you've been talking about for the last 2 years. So I'm not going to recommend the Wall Street Journal. I'm not going to recommend a host of other websites. I'm going to recommend my newsletter because I got it right.
Well, I guess before we let you go, are there any last thoughts you'd like to add? And so the website then is www.goldenjackass.com if they want to learn more.
That's the website. It's been in operation now with a newsletter for 13 and a half years. Just had issue number 162, Elijah. On Sunday was posted the second of the September reports, and that is exactly where I went into detail. I had 2 full chapters devoted to the implications on the dollar, the sunset of the petrodollar, the introduction of this gold trade note. It'll evolve into the gold trade note. It has to evolve into something for use in exchanging payments hand to hand for oil. So the newsletter consists of 2 reports It's the Global Money War Report, high-level issues in the dollar defense. And I made a forecast back in 2005, Elijah. It was a very strange forecast. I told people and gathered quite a lot of clients in the first few years. I was totally shocked how it reached 1,000 clients in just the first 3 years. But I made a forecast that the dollar would eventually be defended by the U.S. military and war. Of course, I was told that I was an idiot, and now it's very plain. The second report is called the Gold and Currency Report, and that's where I include issues regarding China, Russia, oil, petrodollar, and the Eurasian trade zone formation. And it is being formed. So I have a lot of coverage of the Eurasian trade zone. This month, not so much because of the Chinese oil for gold news. I thought I got to cover this. I got to explain it well. And, in the course of explaining it in those 2 chapters, I pretty much said, I told you so. I got this right. I regard this forecast on the gold trade note, Elijah, to be the most important correct jackass forecast in 13 years. So if you're looking for a good source of information, start with goldenjackass.com. What are you waiting for? Why would you want to go to some other sites that only have a trickle of information on the sunset of the dollar and the rise of the gold trade note and the reinstallation of the gold standard? I even lay out how it's going to happen in its order. First, with trade payments, and oil in particular. Second, in bank reserves. If banks don't need to hold as many dollars for oil payments, they're not going to. They're going to dump their treasury bills, treasury bonds, and buy up gold, bullion. Okay, the third and final way the gold standard comes into being will be gold-backed currencies. And it'll really be kind of an echo event of the gold trade note backing a currency for oil purchase. And some clown analysts like Charles Hugh Smith have come out with a second denial analytic essay on how the gold standard just cannot work. And it's really shoddy analysis. And it's sad to see because he overlooks a very simple principle. You can have gold backing of currencies if you move up the gold price by a factor of 5 and then install what's called a cover clause for gold and the currency. By that I mean, take this for instance. The Chinese announced their RMB is gold backed, but it's got a 5% cover clause. So if you come up with $1 million of their Chinese currency, you go to their window and you say, I want $50,000 worth of gold, 5% cover clause, redeemable in 5% of its face value on the currency. Smith doesn't get this. He just repeats his stupid arguments that are vapid and not relevant. Okay, there's lots and lots of bad analysis out there. One of the most popular anti-gold arguments is we have so much cash, we can't back it all by gold. Well, sure you can. You have a $7,000 or $12,000 gold price per ounce. You can back a lot more gold. You can back a lot more of the currency. So we're going to get a combination of a higher gold price and a cover clause to back the currencies with gold. But I'm not concerned about backing currencies with gold. I'm concerned about making trade payments with gold bills, like the gold trade note, which will have its backing of the oil for gold futures contract out of Shanghai. And if you think this is all kind of weird science, no. The Russians are selling oil to China, receiving RMB, taking the RMB currency, going to Shanghai and redeeming it for gold. So the Chinese have just compartmentalized. They've unified. They've made a more efficient contract that's an all-in-one. And that's the direction we're going. So I invite people to go to the website, check out the main public page. It's called Main 5, the main web page. It's got public articles. It's got public interviews like this. I try not to repeat interviews unless they give me a link so that the clients and followers can, listen to the same interview as we're recording here. But these are exciting times, but they're also worrisome times. You got to remember the old Chinese symbol for danger and risk. It's the same as opportunity. That's what we're seeing here, two sides. Big risks from the fading of the dollar. This is the sunset and end of the petrodollar. That means countries are not going to be putting their bank reserves in the treasury bond because they don't need the treasuries to buy oil. That is the essence of the petrodollar, which means they're going to dump their treasuries in their reserves for their banking systems. And they're going to buy gold because that's what they're going to use to buy oil. And what starts with the oil payments will continue with the grain payments for soybean, corn, wheat. They're going to continue with the other commodities, payments for lumber, coal, iron, cement. And then comes the final piece, international contracts. They're going to be done in gold payments, like the gold trade note. There's a whole lot more I could say about that, like I have in the past. The conversion of international contracts from the dollar to the gold, it's coming. When you have this gold trade note and you have countries that are requiring the United States to make payment for what comes into the U.S. ports in something besides the dollar, you know that the revolt globally has hit crisis levels. Very exciting times, Elijah, and the U.S. will not escape with another piece of toilet paper to pay the countries who use their good, honest, hard work, design, development, production to export goods on ships to the U.S. They're not going to accept dollars anymore. And one of the biggest reasons why is that we're printing trillions to cover our debts, to cover our broken bonds, and to cover our derivative machinery that supports the whole system. The whole world is watching the Fed, QE, Department of Treasury with their funny money paper mills to print money to cover our debts. We're acting like an African or South American nation replete with unsterilized hyper-monetary inflation, and the world does not want the dollar anymore because we've ruined it. Interesting times, Elijah. I get up in the morning and I go to my computer to do various tasks, and then I immediately look to see what are the new events of the day that continue in the non-dollar parade, the anti-dollar movement. There's always something. All right, well, thanks for having me on, Elijah. It's been fun. It's always interesting, and I hope your listening audience goes to goldenjackass.com. I mean, there's a lot of economic damage out there. So when people make a new order, I realize they're probably under some kind of hardship. Very much appreciated. These are difficult times for people. But we must remain informed, because you turn on the U.S. news and all you get is a bunch of rubbish. I don't give a rat's ass about whether the NFL players are on one knee or still in the locker room during the national anthem. One detail people need to know about the NFL like that is that the U.S. military has a $5 million contract to the NFL annually to have honor guards on the field. We've militarized our sports arenas. So there's a little bit of resistance. All right, well, thanks for having me on, Elijah. Good luck to you.
Same to you, Jim. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, bye now.